On the fateful day of October 12, 1972, a small plane departing from Uruguay was destined for Santiago, Chile. On board were rugby players, tall and hardy, along with their families, a total of 45 souls. They didn't know that this trip would become a big, tough adventure against the powerful Andes Mountains. Normally, a flight from Uruguay to Santiago takes about 3 hours. However, there's a catch. The route goes over the huge Andes Mountains. These mountains, located in South America, are the world's longest mountain range, second only to the Himalayas in height. But in our story, these beautiful mountains became a real problem for the passengers. On that day, October 12, a storm hit the mountains. This made it impossible for the plane to keep going. So the smart pilots decided to stop and try again the next day. They landed in Mendoza, Argentina, for a night's rest. The very next day, on October 13th, the plane soared back into the sky at 2:18 p.m. The pilots made sure the weather was good to go. The flight sailed smoothly for about an hour. Then, at 3:21 p.m., the pilots began to bring the plane down. The plane was almost near Santiago, but still surrounded by mountains, as there are tall mountains close to the city. While coming down, the plane experienced a sudden and intense shake. At the same time, thick clouds gathered around the plane, making it impossible to see anything except clouds. Suddenly, alarms blared and warning lights flashed, leaving everyone puzzled. Surprisingly, the rugby players on board weren't afraid. They didn't think the shaking was a big deal. Amid jokes, a passenger glanced out of the window and saw the clouds clearing up. But then he noticed something alarming. They were dangerously close to a mountain. Just as the plane moved out of the clouds, the pilots realized they were heading straight for a massive rock. In a sudden panic, they desperately tried to lift the plane up. The ground collision alarm in the aircraft blared loudly. The pilots pushed the engines to the max to gain altitude and fly over the mountain safely. Unfortunately, it was too late. The back of the plane collided with the mountain, causing the entire rear section to separate. 2 rows of seats flew out. 3 passengers went along with them and disappeared. The plane climbed for a few more seconds, but suddenly began to descend. Shortly after, another collision occurred, breaking the left wing. More passengers were thrown out and fell. Now, only the front part of the plane remained, and it landed on a glacier. It slid down the glacier at a speedy 350 kilometers/et and eventually crashed after a 700-meter drop. Everything inside was wrecked. Passenger seats were torn from the base, the cockpit was completely crushed, and the pilots lost their lives instantly. This broken plane rested on an unknown Andes mountain at a height of 3,570 meters. Surprisingly, out of the 45 people on board, 33 survived, many were injured, and they had no idea where they were stuck. Later, it was revealed the plane was 80 kilometers off its planned route, marking the beginning of a harrowing journey of survival. This is the emotional story of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571. Let's dive into it. Right after this crash, there were 2 survivors who weren't seriously injured, 19-year-old Roberto Canessa and 20-year-old Gustavo Zerbino. Since both of them were medical students, they immediately assessed who was alive and tended to the injured. One passenger, 23-year-old Fernando Parado, was in a coma due to a skull fracture. Meanwhile, 1 hour after the plane disappeared, the Chilean Air Search and Rescue Service received a notification. 4 aircraft were sent on a search, but they couldn't find the crash site in the snowy mountains. The issue was the plane's white color, making it hard to spot in the snowy mountains where everything was white. The survivors, still hopeful, had a challenging night. Sadly, 5 injured passengers couldn't make it through the snowy night. The number of survivors dropped from 33 to 28. The remaining 28 survivors used the plane's body as a shelter, closing the rear with luggage, seats, and snow. On October 14th, 11 aircraft from Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay joined the search. Despite being in the right area, they couldn't locate the crash site. The survivors attempted to signal with a lipstick-written SOS and a makeshift cross in the snow, but it went unnoticed. On October 15th, realizing the need for water, a passenger named Fito Strach cleverly used a metal sheet as a solar collector concentrating sunlight to melt snow. He collected the water droplets in empty wine bottles. They also used seat cushions as snowshoes and wool from seat covers for warmth. On October 16th, 3 days after the crash, Fernando Parrado woke up from his coma. He discovered his mother had passed away in the crash, and his 19-year-old sister was severely injured. Parrado did his best to care for his sister, bringing her food and water. Unfortunately, after 8 days, his sister succumbed to her injuries. Most of the passengers were from coastal areas and had never seen snow before. Now, in the freezing -30°C temperatures, at a high altitude, and with no proper food or water, they somehow managed to survive. On October 21st, 8 days after the crash, the search and rescue teams gave up. They believed that there was little chance that anyone could have survived after so many days. After 142 hours of searching, the operation was officially called off. The survivors found a transistor radio in the plane, and Roy Harley, who had knowledge of electronics, managed to make it work. Unfortunately, it could only receive signals. They couldn't send messages. Learning, 11 days after the crash, that the search operation had been canceled left them heartbroken. However, Fernando Parrado stayed composed and started planning. Food was running out, and rationing wasn't enough. Parrado even survived on just one chocolate-covered peanut for 3 days, but by the 11th day, they had almost no food left, resorting to desperate attempts to eat parts of the plane, like cotton from the seats and leather, but it only made them sicker. In a dire situation with no alternative but starvation, the survivors made a shocking decision to stay alive. They ate the deceased bodies of their friends and family. Things got even worse that night. They heard a loud noise, and it was an avalanche. Lots of snow came down super fast from the mountain, covering the broken plane. Sadly, 8 people got stuck in the snow and couldn't breathe. Now, only 19 survivors are left. The remaining 19 people were trapped under the snow. Parrado used a metal pole to make a hole for air. After working really hard for 2 days, they dug a tunnel in the snow and finally made it to the surface. After getting out, they spotted a snowstorm coming and wisely returned to their snow cave for the next 3 days. When they surfaced again, the weather was clear, but they realized no one was coming to save them. Determined to survive, they knew waiting at the crash site wouldn't help. So Canessa, Parrado, and Vizintin, the strongest survivors, decided to explore for help. They estimated their location based on the co-pilot's mention of Curicó, thinking walking west would lead them to Chile's countryside. Unfortunately, they were way off. The crash site was 89 kilometers east, in the Andes Mountains. Still unaware, they rested for a few days to gather energy. On November 15th, 33 days after the crash, they embarked eastward and found the rear piece of their broken plane. Inside, they discovered valuable supplies, including a 2-way radio system that could send messages. Deciding to spend the night at the rear piece of the plane, the next day, during their expedition, they walked a bit further east. Realizing the need for the aircraft's radio, they planned to turn it on by obtaining batteries from the tail section. Unfortunately, the plan failed due to electrical system incompatibility. Facing the harsh reality, they concluded that survival required walking westward. On December 11th, 59 days post-crash, an avalanche struck, claiming 3 more lives. Only 16 survivors remained. On December 12th, 2 months after the crash, Parrado, Canessa, and Vizintin, lacking proper mountaineering gear, set out to climb the glacier, believing Chile was westward. Hoping for help within 2 to 3 days, they packed a 3-day supply of meat. To shield himself from the cold, Parrado layered 3 pairs of jeans, 3 sweaters over his t-shirt, and 4 pairs of socks, even adding plastic bags over the socks. Lacking technical gear, maps, compasses, or climbing experience, the trio faced thin air and oxygen deprivation at high altitude. Despite these challenges, they pressed on towards the mountain. Their handmade sleeping bag provided nighttime warmth, and during the day, they moved forward with slow, deliberate steps. However, by the 4th day, they realized their estimation was way off, and the endless mountains stretched before them. Due to limited food, Vizintin decided to return to the crash site, while Parrado and Canessa continued climbing. After 3 hours, they reached the peak. All they could see were snow-covered mountains everywhere and nothing else. The sight was disheartening. Parado, struggling to process the reality, on the far western horizon, they saw two mountain peaks without snow. Determined, they chose to continue in that direction. Giving up was not an option.
I realized that everything we thought was wrong. We weren't in the foothills. We were in the middle of a mountain chain. There was no chance of surviving. Absolutely no chance.
Parado and Knesset continued their journey for several days until they reached a valley with a flowing river, which was a significant relief in their situation. Following the downstream path of the river, they walked tirelessly for 9 days. On December 20th, after trekking for a total of 9 days, they encountered signs of human presence. Spotting 3 men on horses on the other side of the river, Parado tried to shout for help, but the river's loud noise drowned out his voice. Fortunately, one of the men noticed them and returned the next day with paper and pencils. Using a stone attached to a thread, Parado wrote in Spanish about their plane crash, their origin in Uruguay, their 10-day journey, and the urgent need for help. He expressed their weakness, lack of food, and inability to continue walking. The man, Sergio Catalan, understood the message and, after consulting his friends, remembered hearing about a plane crash on the news a few months earlier. Shocked to discover survivors after 2 months, Sergio rode his horse for 10 hours to reach the nearest city. He conveyed the survivors' message to the army in Santiago. Meanwhile, Parado and Knesset were brought to Los Matines on horses by the farmers, where they could finally get some much-needed rest. Parado and Knesset hiked an incredible 61 kilometers on foot in the last 10 days, displaying sheer will. Knesset had lost half of his body weight, weighing only 44 kilograms. Their story gained international attention, leading the Chilean Air Force to send 3 helicopters for immediate rescue. Parado, equipped with the pilot's flight chart, helped locate the crash site. On December 22, 1972, 70 days after the crash, 2 search and rescue helicopters reached the survivors, rescuing 16 of them. Despite severe conditions, including altitude sickness and malnutrition, all survivors recovered. This story teaches us that even in very tough times, people can stay strong. After a plane crash in the mountains, the survivors showed amazing courage. Their story tells us that when things are really hard, believing in yourself and never giving up can bring incredible results. That's why people also call this disaster the miracle of the Andes. It reminds us that no matter how difficult the situation, a strong will to survive can overcome almost anything.